Hello, everybody. Firstly, thank you all for coming. I really appreciate you turning up to learn about something that is now actually not a secret anymore. You're probably aware that I'm here to talk about variables. I spend a lot of time in my job at Figma as a designer advocate, talking to people like you, talking about components, styles, now variables, design systems more broadly, and I nerd out a lot about really in-depth things like, have you noticed how next to product operations we have hex? That one has a border, and this one doesn't have a border. That's the kind of things that I'm paying attention to all the time within design systems more broadly, and I want to know why. So whoever designed this, please let me know why. I'm curious to know whether it's a pill, a tag, a label, whatever you're calling it. That's what I'd love to discuss at some point today. But today, we're here to talk about variables. As I said, my name is Louis. I do hang out on Twitter quite a lot. I'm a little sensitive about it being rebranded to X, but we'll talk about that again later. And I work at Figma as a designer advocate. Today's agenda, we're going to be covering 5 things, roughly, as I talk you through the feature. You've probably all started to play around with variables. If you haven't, that is totally fine. There is no rush to jump into any of these features. I'm here to hopefully help you navigate them. We're going to be running through the basics because I think that is incredibly important. When you're thinking about design systems in general, you need to have a really solid foundation before you go and play around with any new complex things. So getting that foundation on the ground is incredibly important to get that confidence level up in yourself, in your team, and your business more widely. Then we're going to talk a little bit about organization. I'm going to be sprinkling some quick tips around. This is not a dedicated section of the presentation itself. We'll talk about migration, because that is very important. Every design systems team needs to migrate constantly between different platforms, different tool stacks, terminologies, and understandings. And then I'm going to talk at the end about things maybe we shouldn't be doing with variables, because I've been seeing some things in the community where I just want to help guide people in the right direction as you're starting to use these features. And with that, let's talk about the basics. With variables launch, which happened a few months ago at our conference, we launched with 4 types that allowed you to create variables for color, self-explanatory. This is something that is a color, hex value, RGB, HSL, whatever you're preferring. A string variable, which you can use to create effectively text strings. And I've seen people take this anywhere from something like the label on a button all the way up to an entire screen being driven by variables that are text strings. I probably wouldn't encourage you to go to that level of detail, but it is possible to do batch translation, that kind of thing, within variables themselves. The third one is numbers, and these can be used in different ways. So, for example, in your radius, padding, in prototyping, if you want to do calculations, it's really useful for the number type variable. And lastly, the Boolean type. Again, this is something that's probably more useful in prototyping context, but you can still use those within your design systems, and I'll be talking specifically about design systems use cases of variables today. There are other types in the pipeline as well. Here's just a few of them, but we're looking to encourage the proliferation of variables basically across your entire system over the next 12, 24 months as we release new types. So images is one of them, typography is another one, grids, shadows, those kinds of things are the next variable types that we'll be looking to support. When it comes to structure, variables live within your files just as components, just as styles do. So if we look at the overarching bucket of the file, what we can now create within those is what we call a collection. And a collection, as the definition of the word would suggest, is a big group or a bucket of things. And in this case, it's a big bucket of variables. So within those collections, you create your variables, and you can create as many different collections as you need within those files. You can also reference across collections. So if you decide you want to have something in one collection and something else in a different collection, they can be referenced between each other. Within those collections, we create the variables themselves, and every variable has a value represented by the hash symbol in here. Where this becomes way more powerful than traditional management of what we would have as styles is that you can now have different modes in your variables. So the typical example is something like a day and a night mode within your design system. You might have a BG error for the background of your error state on maybe a warning component or something like that, which would have different hex values according to which system theme that somebody has decided. So day mode would get this hex value, and night mode would get the other hex value. This consolidates a lot of the work that we would have had to do before, and I'll touch on that a little bit later. Then we start to think about the different variable levels that we have within our system. And the way we typically look at this is that there's 3 different levels of the architecture of a variable. The primitive level, as you can imagine, primitive basically means the lowest form of level of variable that we have. This is where you call something what it basically looks like. So you might have a red, orange, green, purple, size 4, something like that, to describe exactly what it is. You know what you're going to get when you search for red. You're going to get a red color being returned. What we would then do is look to introduce the middle section here called the semantic layer. And this is where you effectively describe what that variable does. You don't describe what it looks like, you describe how it should be used. So for example, if we take the red 300 example, that might be a red, slightly strong background tint. That would probably be used as the background color for your danger component. So if you have an alert, which is the danger variation or danger variant, that might inherit or alias the red 300 value. The last section on here is the component level, which I would actually say don't do, but I've put it up here because it's very important to understand what is possible within our design systems. And the component layer is where you go very, very specific. So you very tightly scope your variables down to, for example, the background of the button. You could create a variable specifically for that use case. If we take the example that I've used a few times of the alert danger or alert error, you could create background alert danger, background alert danger hover, background alert danger focus, etc. However, what we would typically try to encourage is that we rely specifically on the middle layer, the semantic layer. If your background alert danger is the same value as BG danger, let's use that middle layer. We don't necessarily need to introduce new variables because that introduces the amount of maintenance that we have, the complexity of our system, and the global amount of variables that we need to then look after as a design systems team. Where it does become really useful to introduce that component layer is if you're in a really massive system. If you are, for example, Google, and I'm sure lots of you have a Gmail account, you would have noticed a few months ago that they introduced loads of different variations or A/B testing on the compose email button. The background color changed a lot, the padding changed a lot, the font size may be changed, the icon color changed loads and loads of times over the course of a few different months as they were doing experiments. And that, to me, means component. A component variable would be specifically used for those different variations of those tests. What it does allow you to then do is separate the compose button from the other buttons in your design system. All the rest of them can look the same, act the same, but we pull that out as a specific component variable and add those modifications to that layer. So component tokens can be useful, just maybe not all the time. Let's talk a little bit about organization. And I'm going to break this down into 3 sections: the files themselves, the collections, and then within those collections, the groups as well. Typically, what we'd do instinctively when we create these variables in our design system is create a single file, or even use the existing file that we have, our foundations file, which we have styles, put our primitives in there, put our semantics in there, and alias between them. I would say don't do this. And there's a few reasons why I would encourage you to not do this, but the biggest reason is for maintenance and discoverability. You, as the design systems maintainer, if you have everything inside one library file and you go to search for something, that may return all your primitives and all your semantics, and if you're using component variables, all the component variables too. That's a lot of noise in your design system. So what I would encourage you to do is to actually split those primitives and semantics into separate variable files, which would enable you to have that easier maintenance as you're starting to create, maintain, distribute your components and styles and variables across your system. It's a pretty small move, but would encourage as well the future state where maybe you need different semantic libraries for different products or different brands. They may be driven from the same central primitive library, and it allows you to basically create as many different semantic variations that you need from that single central primitive library. If everything's in the same file, you're stuck. So I'd encourage you to split those primitives and those semantics into separate files. And I've said the word semantic a lot, This is probably a new phrase for most of us in the industry over the past few months as we start to think about introducing variables or tokens or something like that into our system. So I've just got a handful of examples here of what could look like a semantic name in your design system. This might not work for you, but it's just something to get you thinking about what that would do. And as I said at the start, the semantic name is what you describe the intention of that component. It's not what it looks like. So if you take the action as maybe it's a button, but maybe in a broader sense, action hover tells me that when I hover on something, I'm going to get a different variable to the default state. It doesn't tell me what it looks like. It doesn't tell me that it's blue or purple or green. I just know that it's the main action on that website. Some examples of number variables here as well. So padding small might be something that you introduce to your auto layout settings to encourage people to use a semantic name for those padding settings. As we organize these in our system, this is a typical structure that I would like to encourage you to use, where we follow that separate file for each individual primitive semantic split. Within those, we create our variables, and we alias between those levels. Primitive library, semantic library, alias between the variables to encourage a much richer experience and easier maintenance. Let's talk about migration. So migration is a really important part of any design system team's work, particularly as something new arrives in the industry. So as Figma introduced variables, we very quickly found that people's first question was, how do I use that in my existing system? Which is a migration question. So I look at this as in 4 stages, really. The first one is probably where you start, which is you don't have any variables in your system, and that's totally fine. The next one was the small steps that we can introduce now to encourage variable usage across the entire ecosystem of our design team. The next one was where we look at the migration and the deprecation of certain elements within our design system, because as we introduce variables, we can remove certain things. So that makes us way more efficient. The last step is where we have variables everywhere, and everybody's really happy, the design system's perfect, and we're all doing a great job. Visually, this is how I typically look at that over time. So I'd have a few different axes. The y-axis being complexity of how this is across your design system. And the x-axis, I've put 6 months, but that could be, sorry, you can't see this. That could be anything from a week to 2 years, depending on the complexity of your system. If you're in a massive system, multiple products, multiple brands, that may look like a long time. If you're in a small system where it's just a couple of websites or something, that might take a really short amount of time. So we have those small steps that we can introduce now. We have the migration and deprecation part, and then we rapidly iterate upwards to that variables everywhere section when we have variables used in every single component, every single screen across our design. So those small steps that I spoke about, these are something we can do without introducing any breaking changes to our designs. We can look at introducing 3 things. And these are actually number variables. They're not colors at all. But the way that I look at this is that if you plan variables as an introduction on your roadmap, this might take a longer time to roll everything out, particularly if you have a complex system. But because radius, padding, and gap tokens or variables was not supported until now, you can introduce those immediately. You can create your primitive number scale. You can create your semantic number scale for these 3 different things and introduce those into your design system immediately to seemingly no effect on the team because it should just work. What that would also allow you to do is to spot inconsistencies within your components and your screens now. You may find that at the moment, some of your components are using 16, some of them are using 15, 17, 18, 20. And as part of the process of rolling out variables, you may introduce that audit across the entire system to consolidate those mistakes or errors and roll out a variable structure which consolidates those down into a single design system release. Similar to before, I would structure these in the exact same way as the colors, where we would have the primitive collection, the semantic collection for our sizes. Within those, you'll notice, if you can see on the screen, we have 3 groups. And these are the 3 different types of variable that I showed you before. The radius group, the padding group, and the gap group. You might alternatively call this margin, but gap is pretty much aligned with the Figma terminology for auto layout. So we have these primitive values where space 4 is 4 pixels, 8 pixels, etc. But then we we could use a t-shirt sizing approach to the semantic naming in here. The industry is not necessarily aligned on the naming terminology for semantic sizing variables. So t-shirt sizing might work for you. However, you may end up in a situation where you realize that you need something between small and medium. And that's a problem. So until you hit that point, you can rely on something like t-shirt sizing for your semantic ramp. But if you hit a problem, that's when we start to realize a different solution might be what we need to do. When it comes to migration and deprecation, there are a few things that introducing variables will enable us to do as a team, specifically the design systems team. The first one is file location, and this is where we decide where things live. The second one is the consolidation of components and/or themes and styles. And the third one is how we can use plugins to enable this to happen. The first one is file location. And I mentioned before about encouraging a split between primitive and semantic variables in different files. However, there's also something really important that I would encourage you to consider as well. And this is taking variables out of the existing system foundations file at the first moment. So we probably have a library where you have your styles right now, but I would encourage you to create a separate file for the variables. There's a very important reason for that, and that is mostly because of deprecation. Over the next year, 2 years, or something like that, you're probably going to want to deprecate using styles specifically for color. That means deleting them from your system. Right now, you can set the fill of the style to be a variable, but if you ultimately want to delete those styles, which you definitely can, the way that Figma works from a back-end perspective is that we store a reference to all those styles that exist. So even if you delete those from your libraries, they will still technically exist within the file. This means that your file size would increase. So what we want to encourage is having your styles at the moment separate from the variables which you will migrate to over time. You could then deprecate the entire file of your styles right now and rely just solely on that variables file. So for performance reasons, I would encourage you to separate those out. On a consolidation point, it's very common up until this point for people to use different components for theming. You might have a light mode component, a dark mode component. They might be separate components or different variants within the same component. Over time, as you introduce modes and variables to your system, you can delete those out of the system. However, if you delete anything, that is a breaking change. So just make sure you're communicating that to your wider team and ensuring that any references to those components are handled. You probably have hundreds of files that are using a component at the moment, which you want to delete at some point. Just make sure that is communicated to everybody and everybody understands what's about to happen. Similarly, you're probably going to delete loads of styles. If you have light mode and dark mode styles at the moment, eventually over time, we can not only encourage a renaming process to remove those themes from the name, but also just solely rely on the variable to encourage that theming process. So again, you'll be deleting things, but as soon as you delete something, that encourages a deprecation somewhere else. So when any file that is using a style that you want to delete, just make sure that you communicate that to the wider team. When it comes to migration, there's a few plugins that I would encourage you to check out. If you have a system where you do support a light mode or dark mode, maybe a high contrast mode or something like that, this plugin by Jan Edern is conveniently called Styles to Variables. It's something that I would encourage you to check out. It allows you to convert all your styles into variables in seconds. It's really, really useful. The second one, if you rely on pulling variables or tokens in from your engineering stack, maybe your developers have already got this set up and have a convenient JSON file for you to use. This plugin by Travis called Variables Import is a really nice way to import JSON variables or tokens into your Figma library. And lastly, if you're looking to import or export variables across different files, this one by Honza, who's actually in the audience today, I believe, is a really useful plugin to allow you to move things around your Figma system. On to things to avoid. So as I said at the start, there are things that we typically find ourselves instinctively doing when we're testing out new features, particularly variables themselves. And here's just a few pointers that I would encourage you to think about as you're rolling these out in your system. The first thing that I've seen has become very common is to take our existing variant setup. If we take an example of a card, you might have a hover state for the card, a focus state for the card, an inactive state. what is very easy to think about is transitioning those states into modes in variables. I would encourage you to not do that and rely on variable modes specifically for theming. So if we take the card example, card background would be the default variable. Card background hover, different variable. Card background inactive, different variable. Card background focus, different variable. They would not be modes, they would be variables. So we look at the axis this way instead of this way. Those variables could then be themed according to light and dark mode as the modes, but the variables themselves are still distinct and separate variables. The second one is I'd encourage you to not jump straight in. It's very easy for us to go into our design systems, create loads of variables, and start playing around rapidly and producing and publishing those things. However, planning is the most important thing right now. Because of how rigid these variable structures can be, and the deprecation changes and migration changes that I mentioned could happen, you want to make sure that you plan this really properly out before you start to introduce those variables. I would encourage you to create a spreadsheet where you list out all the variable implementations that you need before you go and create them, which actually is part 3. Improper planning can mean that we end up making mistakes and that we need to go back in version history to roll back things that we maybe should have done before. So make sure we plan those out. Lastly, I said at the start that component variables are something we probably shouldn't do. Seriously consider whether you need to use component variables. It's very tempting to go to that level of detail, but I would encourage you to think about the semantic layer before you go down to that layer itself. Thank you very much for listening, and thanks for coming. I hope you all enjoy the rest of your conference.